These days at NCC Tokyo, we are actually doing a 12-week sermon series called The Life of Jesus. So we're looking at the most notable life events of Jesus for 12 weeks. Last week was, do you remember, for those of you that were in the service, what did we talk about last week? Virgin birth of Jesus, okay? A birth of Jesus through Virgin Mary. And last week, we said how unless you believe that Jesus was born from Virgin Mary, this entire puzzle of doctrine of salvation would not be completed unless you really believe in that. So we talked about that. Today, we're looking at a very unique passage in the Bible where it tells us about 10 years of Jesus' life. And you won't find this anywhere else in the Bible but Gospel of Luke. And if you look at 4 Gospels in the Bible, a lot of the Gospel writers are primarily interested in the salvation work of Jesus. That's why most of them, when they write things about Jesus, they don't write stuff up during his teen years. Most of them focus on his life towards the end. Like last couple weeks, especially if you look at the Gospel of John, chapter 12 through like all the way towards the end, he only covers last like couple weeks. And the resurrection life a little bit in the chapter 24. So they're mostly interested in what Jesus did, mostly on the cross and when he was resurrected from the dead, right? But here, what we find is very unique, the Gospel of Luke, because he wrote down what nobody else did, the teen life of Jesus, okay? And it's a strange story as well, if you know. You know what I'm talking about? How many of you are really familiar with this story? Like you listened to this story in your Sunday school days when you were little. I have an experience of hearing this over and over when I was growing up and always thought it was a little strange. Like, did you ever think that? This is a little strange. Like the Sunday school teachers do really well in describing what Jesus was like as a 12-year-old boy. He was a very smart kid. He was very cute. People loved him. Look at him. But then, like, if you really look at this story, verse 49, it's like, teachers never explained to me what verse 49 really meant. It's very strange. If you read this for the very first time, for non-Christians to read this for the first time, they will think it's very odd. Verse 49, because Jesus is being culturally and morally very disrespectful to his parents. Like, how could you? Even for Americans, this is disrespectful. You know what I mean? In Japanese, it's a crime if you do this to your parents. All right. And you're reading this and you're like, what's going on here? What's going on? And think about it really logically here, okay? If you are the gospel writer, you want people to believe that Jesus is the Savior, okay? Then you would write up a story regarding Jesus that's somewhat graceful, that, you know, that people would like to listen to. Like you know, he's like a heroic figure. But if, like, you show them this story, it does exactly the opposite. You know what I'm saying? It's counterproductive to say Jesus did this when he was 12 years old. People will look at this. That's really strange. That's your Savior? That's weird. And let me tell you, if I was a gospel writer, I would have hesitated to include this story in the gospel. I definitely would have hesitated, okay? Even if you knew this happened when it was 12, I would try to leave that one out because it's not very good. The only conclusion we can make out of this is this. It must have really happened. Because, you know, theologically speaking, I don't know if you really want this, because Luke, last week I talked about how Luke went to Jerusalem and he talked with all the witnesses of Jesus. He probably talked to family members of Jesus in Jerusalem. It might have been his mother Mary, or it could have been Jesus, one of the brothers, okay? He heard the story of what took place when Jesus was 12 years old, and he simply wrote it down, regardless whether he really understood the deeper meaning of this or not. He just wrote it down. So the only conclusion we can come out with this must have happened because he put it in there. Like, you wouldn't make this stuff up, okay? So based on this, we're going to focus on 2 points today. The first one is, what does this story tell us about Jesus? What does this tell us about his identity? Second is, we're going to get the conclusion and then application. What does this mean to us? Okay, simple 2 points. Okay, first one. What does this tell us about Jesus? And I'm going to have sub-points, subcategories there, A and B. First of all, it tells about uniqueness of Jesus, He's very unique. Today's passage, we see Jesus is a 12-year-old boy, is going to Jerusalem for the Passover feast that typically lasted 7 days. And remember, in Jewish culture, they have a thing called bar mitzvah. Once boys turn 13, you're a responsible adult now. Now, Jesus is 12 here, okay? So what's happening here is Joseph and, Jesus' parents are taking him to Jerusalem. And during this Passover period, Joseph must have taught Jesus, this is what you're going to be doing as an adult from next year. So he's showing all these religious, ceremonial instructions to him. And once the feast is over, they all go back home, back to Nazareth, which was about 20 miles north of Jerusalem. Okay, they're all going back home. And you have to understand the communal nature of family ties back then, okay? Right now, you're like, how could you lose your son on the way back home? That's impossible. But you have to understand the communal nature of it. Because back then, people, relatives, extended families lived together in the same village. And they all came together as one big clan to Jerusalem. Now they're all going back home together with the caravan, okay? So ladies will go to the front with their children. And the men will stay back in the back. And then they go with the family, okay? So Joseph might have thought maybe Jesus is at the front, okay, with Mary. Mary might have thought maybe Jesus is in the back, okay? And verse 43 and onward, Joseph and Mary realizes Jesus isn't there, okay? And as soon as they realize that, they rush back to Jerusalem and finds him in the temple. Verse 46. A 12-year-old boy, Jesus, sitting in the temple, sitting among the teachers, listening to them and asking them questions. And all who heard him, verse 47, all who heard him were amazed at his understanding and his answers. He's just way ahead of his age, okay? Can you imagine a boy, 12-year-old boy coming in here? He's like unpacking the truth of book of Daniel, book of Ezekiel. Wow, it's amazing. This boy, who is this boy, right? That's what's happening to Jesus here. Verse 48, his parents walk in and they were astonished. They're astonished. And Mary goes on to say, son, why have you treated us so? Behold, your father and I have been searching for you in great distress. They probably thought Jesus was kidnapped and he was sold into slavery in Egypt or something like that. Do you remember the story of Good Samaritan? There are a lot of bandits everywhere. They're very dangerous, and they might have thought that. So we were looking for you in great sorrow and distress. And here comes the answer of Jesus in verse 49. It says, why were you looking for me? Did you not know that I must be in my Father's house? There's a different translation of this, okay? If you have an ESV or something, you might have a different translation underneath in your footnotes. This is a different translation here. Did you not know that I must be about my Father's business is another translation of it, okay? I must be in my Father's house. I must be about my Father's business. And just understand this is a 12-year-old Jesus saying this. 12-year-old, okay? Let me tell you why this is so unique. At age 12, he's already fully aware of his own identity. Okay? He knows that he's a son of God. You can even say he understood his mission on earth. Okay? He knows what he's doing. And Mary says, don't you know that we were really worried? Your father was worried. And Jesus says, I am in my Father's house. Okay? He understands who he is, really. He's not lost. Okay? Why is this unique? Let me just give some comparison. The founder of Islam, Muhammad, when he first claimed to have received revelation from God, the historical record says that he was confused. He wasn't sure what this is about. He didn't know what to make of it, okay? Because he wasn't sure. And the record says, later on, people came along and assured him it must be the voice from God. And they started the religion called Islam, okay? That was Muhammad's case. Think about the founder of Buddhism, Buddha. He was already an adult. He left the palace. He had a wife, he had a son. He left them in search for the answer. He thought there must be something more to this life and leaves his family in search for the answer. Okay? Even at enlightenment, he said, I did not attain all the perfect purity, but I think I found the way, he says. Okay? If you work hard as I did, you might be able to find that living path, good path for you. But he never said I attained perfection. Okay, just think about it. Both Muhammad and Buddha did not start off with the answer. The truth. You know what I'm talking about? They were already grown-up adults. And then they left, trying to figure out this life. And they're claiming that they found the answer along the way of the journey. In comparison, just think about it. The beginning of Jesus is very different. At age 12, he starts off with full knowledge of what he's about to do. He already knows who he is as a person. So in a way, he's starting off with the answer. He already knows. You know what? People were astonished at him, about him. Incredible biblical knowledge. And I don't even think Jesus shared even 1% of what he really knew. Otherwise, it would have blown people away. But people were just astonished about him. He starts off with the truth. You know, the Muslim scholars will tell you, Muhammad, at one point in his life, was taken up to heaven. And on a single journey, got a glimpse of what heaven looks like, got a little taste of what heaven is like. And just think about it. Even if that's true, just the fact that Muhammad had to be taken up to heaven, it warrants the fact that heaven was foreign to Muhammad. Muhammad really didn't know what heaven was like before he was taken up there. Okay? In comparison, think about Jesus. Jesus comes along. He says, I am the bread from heaven. He says, I am the true manna. John chapter 8, he keeps on saying, you're from below, I'm from above. I'm not of this world. In John chapter 8, he says something that's mind-blowing. He says, before Abraham was, I am. Abraham saw my days and he was glad. So just listening to all these religious figures and you want to bring them on the same level and evaluate them, you can't just say they're all saying the same thing. Because you look at Jesus in comparison to those people, he's completely in a different category. He's completely in a different world. So you can't just say they're all same, okay? So people find 12-year-old Jesus to be amazing, not strange, okay? They feel something extraordinary about Jesus. That's the first point. He was very unique. That's the first point. Second point is Jesus clearly understood the Father's business. Let me read part of 49 again, okay? Why were you looking for me? Did you not know that I must be in my Father's house, which means I must be about my Father's business? It's like, didn't you know that I was doing my Father's business, okay? The work that honors God. It almost sounds like, Mary, you really should have known what I was up to. It sounds like that. Did you not know that I was doing this? And many scholars commenting on this verse, both liberals and conservative ones, they both say, they pretty much agree on what verse 49 means. This is what they say. This is an English Bible called the Transformation Bible. The Transformation Bible says this. Luke portrays a boy, Jesus growing into a man, submitting to his parents while at the same time making the will of God his main purpose in life. Okay, that's the interpretation of Transformation Bible. And John Calvin, who was one of the reformers in the 16th century, interprets this verse this way. John Calvin. Let me paraphrase what he said, okay? He says, the duty which he owes to God his Father ought to be immeasurably greater, that in comparison his loyalty to his parents can seem insignificant. And John Calvin goes to explain this doctrine, the teaching from verse 49. If we want to put this into a doctrine, this is what it means. that whatever we owe to men must yield to first table of the law, that God's authority over us may remain untouched. Thus, we ought to obey kings and parents and masters, but on in subjection to God. So Jesus is saying in verse 49 to Mary, my relationship with God is so central that it relativizes all the other relationships. That's what he's saying in verse 49. My relationship with God is so central, and all the other relationships are dependent on my relationship with God. God is at the center, all the other relationships on the peripheral. And sure enough, you look at the life of Jesus, everything he does is in line with God's will. Everything Jesus does in the field of God's business. John chapter 8:28, Jesus says, I do nothing on my own authority, but speak just as the Father taught me. Every activity I do, every teaching I give, they're all God's business. They all come from him. And that's what it means to make Father's business my business. At age 12, Jesus understood what he was doing. He understood Father's business. And at age 12, he's telling his parents in an unforgettable fashion that what he is going to do in his ministry. Let me get the conclusion and then application next, okay? So let's conclude this first. Verse 50 and 51. 50 says, and they did not understand the saying that he spoke to them. Again, it's not easy, right? Verse 51, and he went down with them and came to Nazareth and was submissive to them, and his mother treasured up all these things in her heart. Mary goes back home. While going back, she's treasuring this up. It means she's not forgetting it right away. She's remembering this over and over. Just think about it from Mary's perspective, okay? Last 3 days she spent searching for Jesus. Just think about it. For her, it was supposed to be a fun trip to Jerusalem with her extended families. Instead, it became a very agonizing, stressful time for her, emotionally draining 3 days. And she must have recalled the word of Simeon. Simeon comes out in Luke chapter 2, verse 35. Simeon looks at the boy Jesus and tells Mary, because of Jesus, a sword will pierce through your soul. And I think Mary was experiencing part of that, okay? Going through the last 3 days of experience, searching for Jesus. Wow, this is not easy. 21 years later, during the Passover feast, exactly 21 years later, in the same city of Jerusalem, and this time around, the heart of Mary gets absolutely pierced and torn to pieces. She sees her beloved son, Jesus, carrying the cross to the top of the mountain. He's covered in blood, covered in shame. And I think Mary, looking at Jesus getting nailed to the cross, she must have remembered the word of Jesus that Jesus spoke when he was 12 years old. I must be about my Father's business. I'm here to do the will of God. The only true Son of God who obeyed God perfectly and who cherished in doing the work of God every moment of his life. Jesus Christ gets nailed to the cross, abandoned by the Father. He literally becomes the Passover lamb so that those of us who don't deserve can be brought in to be called his brothers and sisters. And the good news is this. From today's passage, the gospel is this. The primary God's business was to save us through the work of Jesus Christ. That was the primary business of God, so that whoever believes in Jesus can be called sons and daughters of God. And let me get to the application, what it means to us. It means God saved us through Jesus Christ, made us into his heirs, okay? He brings us into his business, okay? You're immediately brought into his business. John chapter 15, verse 15 says this. Jesus is telling his disciple, I no longer call you servants, because servants don't know what master is doing, but I call you my friends, because I share with you my Father's business, the things of God. You're my friends now. Apostle Paul goes a little farther in 1 Corinthians chapter 3, verse 9. He says this to Christians, for we are God's fellow workers. NIV says, for we are co-workers in God's service. So do you see this flow? God brings in as his sons and daughters into his family, but not only that, immediately we're brought into God's business together. Let me leave you with 2 application questions, okay? The first question is this. How interested are you in doing your Father's business, okay? In doing what your Heavenly Father is interested in. How interested are you in Father's business? Because for Jesus was saying, don't you know that I'm all about my Father's business? That's what I came here to do. For you as sons and daughters of God, how interested are you? Puritan pastor from the 17th century, Thomas Watson, says this. In one of his books, he says, religion, doing God's business. When he says religion here, he really means Christian life. Christian life, doing God's business should not, this is kind of old English, should not proper only for spare hours, but it must be the grand business of our lives. And then Thomas Watson goes on to quote Apostle Paul, 1 Corinthians 15:10. He says, Apostle Paul says this, I labor more abundantly than all of them, as if to say I was all about God's business. That's what I was crazy about, God's business. Last question, application question is this. Is God's business the grand business of your life? And not doing them in your spare hours, but is it grand business of your life? Your top hours, are they being dedicated for God's business? Let's bow our heads right now. Let's just reflect upon